not enforcing MFA, which we'll talk about later. Or it might be allowing legacy authentication, which we'll also talk about later because they're very directly related. And those two things allowed 365 to be a really good target for cred stuffing, password spraying, and of course, phishing. This becomes really, really important for attackers to be able to do business email compromise. You can see down there in the bottom right, have ways to get into accounts and leverage those accounts to get further into environments. So it becomes just a really good pivot point for attackers to get into it, get data, and push further into those environments, especially if you're talking about hybrid environments, the really old on-prem stuff, and then this really shiny new 365 thing that doesn't happen to be behind 2FA, for example. There's a lot of different interesting ways that it can be leveraged by attackers. The information, of course, for all of us, almost all of us in the world that aren't on G Suite or some other strange other hosted thing, we tend to be on 365 these days. So it has a very large, broad environment. And for us at Blumira, 89% of our organizations also use 365. So we see heavy adoption across 365 broadly inside of our organization as well.
Nato, anything that you want to add to that?
It's so true that Office 365 is oriented for convenience first, just because since it's so convenient for users to use as well, in trade, anything that's convenient enough, oftentimes security is something that convenience and security can be a complicated pair to match. And so if you're just trying to get people enrolled and things like that, then if they have to set up multi-factor authentication and do some of these other things, it's just not like that primary default focus. And so when people are getting phished or attacked, and then Outlook is a major thing that's associated with Office 365, and that's email related. So you click on a phishing link in Outlook, then if you're just running on default features and not monitoring things, then you just have something that's now just up in the cloud, and then you log into different devices, and now it's like attaching itself to all these different devices that you're connecting to. So it makes it a really great target when you're trying to have like a broad impact. You just get in someone's email, and now you can hit their phone, all their devices, their home device, their office devices. You can do quite a bit.
And yeah, and is remote work, a factor here? It's with people moving to the cloud, does that kind of affect how secure Microsoft 365 can be, or, how people prioritize security?
I think it definitely has caused a big impact. At least we have someone saying that they lost audio, which I'm not sure how that could have happened. But I will do a quick ramble while we take the gander at that. I think it's one of those areas where in the beginning of COVID, we saw a lot of people be forced into a situation where they had to move quickly into remote workforce or hybrid environments or ADFS inside of their M365 environments. And what that essentially ends up resulting as is some holes to an extent, but really more what it does is increase the area that you need to monitor and look for risks across your environment. In the olden days, when you're just watching Exchange, you're watching who's touching your Exchange, you might be looking for password spraying against IES and OWA inside of your Exchange server that's sitting in your DMZ. That's a pretty tight, focused area to monitor. Whereas at 365, we see this a lot, where if you have password spraying or cred stuffing against your 365, you can do conditional blocking of access, for example. There's really not a lot you can do. Microsoft is going to eat that password spray forever, to an extent, until they stop it on their side, of course, from their infrastructure. And you, as the person who's getting attacked, can do some work to stop it, but you lose some fidelity in stopping those attacks, but you gain the ability to kind of absorb those attacks using the cloud infrastructure, which means you must have a certain level of security and capability across that environment to allow you to be successful in identifying and having secure users in your environment, which could be MFA, could be password sharing, it could be a number of other things.
Bring your own device is very popular these days as well, and so it just kind of broadens that attack surface, because then maybe someone is logged into Office 365 on some home devices, and those might not be managed devices and all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot that can go into that.
So those are all great points. What about what this will be about primarily is the built-in Microsoft 365 security tools or features that are already within your environment. So what are the benefits of using those tools that are already there? Nato, do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so Office 365 in general has security features for all kinds of things, from like anti-phishing to monitoring alerts and email rules that you can build, all kinds of things to kind of make it a lot easier. And then you can centrally manage things as well. So for anyone who's heard of Active Directory, that is one of the popular things even before Office 365, and then Active Directory is then included in Office 365 plans and services. And so there are a lot of control and centralization options that like large teams can use to keep, say, like a bigger team safe as well, with all kinds of policies and centralized control. It's pretty neat.
Absolutely. And then it maximizes the value of your Microsoft 365 license, which can be pretty costly depending on, your environment. How is a organization supposed to know, what license they have access to? I know that can be kind of confusing for folks because it is a pretty complex question to figure out.
I'm a big fan. So the license that you're on, depending on your environment and how you set it up, I'm a big fan of the site M365 Matrix. We'll link it in chat so you can at least see it. Which does a good job of showing people what you actually have across your environment itself. And Erica can share that. It lets you see what your license, and you could be an Office 365 Enterprise, like an E3, E5. It really depends on how you have approached things. And there's a lot of different ways that people approach licensing, what they want out of their licensing, what's the best way to get it. And generally speaking, really the best way to approach it is, and it sucks for all of us that use 365, is to essentially kind of use the matrix and continuously stay up to date with how Microsoft is changing the names of everything, repackaging everything, and approaching how they're kind of just changing everything around inside of the 365 environment. It makes it miserable to go about, and it's really one of the things that I like least about 365 is that you can be on an E3 license and then be trying to figure out, well, do I have anti-phishing? Well, I don't know. Maybe. What do I need to buy? Well, I need to buy Exchange Online Protection, or I need to buy E5 licenses. And what happens if I just buy a few E5 licenses? Well, at one point, Microsoft's going to reconcile that, and they're going to come to me and say, you pay for the rest of these licenses, or you drop those licenses and move on back to an E3, for example. So it's one of those areas that I really like this tool, 365 Matrix. If you could drop that into the everyone chat, Erica, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And it helps you kind of identify where each of these features live across each of the different licenses that we're going to talk about. And they also update this quickly depending on how you are approaching it and what you're doing inside of your environment. And it doesn't help that everything is named Microsoft Defender for something now. So like Microsoft Defender for 365 Plan 1 is going to get a lot of those anti-phishing, safe attachment, safe link stuff that we'll talk about in the meeting today. And you may not need cloud app security, like that full CASB environment inside of your environment. But if you do, then you have to think about, well, do I want an E5 license? Do I want to buy into this CASB solution in my 365 environment? So it's one of those areas that Microsoft has allowed us, the glory of us, to make hard decisions as to how we want to spend money with 365. And they're going to keep changing it. So it ends up being our responsibility to kind of track it and run it and evaluate it. And here's John Eric, our director of marketing. He's here as well. Oh, he's gone.
Just testing the audio for us.
Okay. He snuck in. He was just saying hello. So it very much is one of those areas that it depends a lot on your organization. It depends a lot on your security needs, which we're going to talk about a lot today. And it depends really on what do you want to get out of your 365 environments? What is your your top level organization buying into? Like, what solutions do you want to solve inside of 365? And what things do you want to protect inside of 365 as well, as pertains to your users or data or anything like that, which we'll talk a little bit more as well when we get into further in.
And to add one thing on top of that, for those who so happen to have a plan that includes Active Directory, then you can go and find modular options. And there's this side like portal.active directory or AD. You can Google how to get to Active Directory's portal. Not every Office 365 plan includes that. So you're going to have to kind of use some of those other tools like what Matt's talking about if you don't have that. And then also digging through Active Directory can be a lot to dig through to figure out what all you have or how to add features, like random things. Like most people don't know that you can have like 50,000 free guests on certain Office 365 plans if you so happen to have the right one. A lot of folks don't even know they can do that.
Those are great tips, Nato. So it definitely helps to know which license you have so that you know which features you can take advantage of. Fortunately, for the first security feature that we have, I believe everyone has access to it. So that is multi-factor authentication. And it seems like Microsoft is really pushing to get people on MFA, at least before October 2022. Matt, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so to give a little backstory for everyone, at RSA this year, I went and listened to the CISO Microsoft speak, and one of the biggest identifiers for them, and really the reason why they're pushing basic authentication to be deprecated and moving everyone to what they call modern authentication, is that the large majority, if not all, attacks against 365 are related to either MFA not being enabled or MFA bypass being leveraged by phishing or attackers, broadly speaking. And you'll see a number of features or a number of moves by Microsoft over the last few months into last year that allow and force basically organizations into being more secure. And it's going to happen in a number of different ways, but I wanted to just kind of generally take a step back and say, enabling MFA will always improve your security outright. It will improve your security broadly across the organization. It is important to do. It will help your organization. Some people might get annoyed by it, but I think we're starting to move past the users being annoyed by MFA because everything makes them MFA. And if you can give them an easier way to MFA or an easier way to approach MFA, you're always going to be up and ahead, generally speaking, as it pertains to MFAing broadly. One of the things that I do want to note, and if you use Blumira or Blumira customer, there is a global report called Legacy Authentication that will do this for you. But if you're not, you have your own SIM or whatever, you look at the user agent that you see there, BAV2 ROPC. That is all legacy authentications that happen inside of your 365 environment for Exchange or however they're authenticating or whichever service they're authenticating into. It's a mix of all of them. So SMTP, IMAP, all of them get rolled into that kind of user agent broadly. So if you're looking for any existing legacy authentication, that's what you want to look for in your logs if you are taking logs out. If you aren't looking at any logs right now, sign up for Blumira free, pull all the logs in, look at it, and you can pay $0 and you can identify where legacy authentication is today if you want to, or don't. But it'd be nice if you did, but you don't have to if you don't want to. I'd recommend you take a gander at it, because if you don't, starting October 2022, I don't remember the exact date, I think it's near the end of the month, Microsoft will be starting to disable all legacy authentication across the entirety of the platform. Will that change? Will they push out the date? I mean, it's Microsoft, so it's possible the date will get pushed. But from what I've been hearing in the conversations that we had at RSA, I don't think it's going to get pushed this time. They want to make a change and they really want to secure their environment, because here at Blumira, we often see business email compromise, accounts being taken over in 365. It is common. And one of the most obvious ways that occurs is because someone had single factor authentication or they were bypassed in phishing, which is not that hard anymore. It seems like it should be, but MFA bypass is not that hard these days. And I'll talk about how you can change that. And it allows them to get in that account. And usually the way that we often see it is that an email forwarding rule will be immediately created and they'll start collecting email out of that account as well. One of the things that I do want to know, and it's there on bullet point 3, it says a preview feature, but I strongly recommend it if you have users that will tolerate it, is to turn on MFA number matching. If you have Azure AD, you have this feature already. Essentially what this does is when they pull up their Authenticator app, which I have no idea why they named their app Authenticator, because it's the same as every other Authenticator app. But nonetheless, if you pull up the Microsoft Authenticator app and you 2FA in, it will require your user to compare the number on their phone with the number on the screen. So it makes it a lot harder for the phishing bypass for MFA of just the push to bypass to happen. It requires that back and forth communication with the user. It's kind of a mix of like classic like TOTP and push MFA, generally speaking, at that point. And it works really, really well for halting those phishing bypasses for MFA. It does make things harder to authenticate, but you will significantly reduce threats to your environment, generally speaking. I will get off my soapbox and I'll let Nato speak if you'd like to.
It's MFA is completely worth it. Just to start there, it's even though I agree with Matt, it can be kind of annoying and cumbersome, and sometimes you'll find that if you turn it on and you have alerts that tell you when people aren't using MFA, because Blumira will alert you if someone's not turning on MFA. Then you can kind of figure out like who are our high risk individuals who aren't turning on those features and all that good stuff. But something to note about MFA, especially for people who are running managed service providers or running software development operations and things like that, is that you can add the OAuth or the MFA functionality to your application platform. So if you're like an app developer and you're like, oh, I need two-factor authentication on this web app that I created, you can actually use Office 365's Azure Active Directory with multi-factor authentication and use that for how individuals log into your web app to add multi-factor from Office 365 to whatever applications that you host and secure. So you can use that feature even outside of Office 365 as long as you have Office 365, especially for if you're using one with Azure Active Directory. It can be really handy for people who are looking at like, and if you're trying to enroll like 1,000 users on an application and stuff like that, and you have like a large volume of stuff going on, think about the time savings of not having to manually manage all of that when you can just centrally just say, hey, Azure Active Directory, manage all of my multi-factor authentication across all of my thousands of users. It's just insane time savings. Plus you can monitor all of that, which is insane.
For sure. Yeah, MFA, SSO, keep everything straightforward inside of Azure AD, make your life easier if you can. It makes, from an admin perspective, it is 1,000 times easier than trying to fight a like, well, did you turn on 2FA in that thing? It makes things much easier for sure.
Right, and that goes back to, the point of just having everything in one place in Microsoft 365 just makes it a lot easier on you to manage, to configure those settings, and to ensure that your security settings are enabled, or at least the ones that you want to be enabled are enabled. So those are great points. Anything else to talk about on MFA that we haven't already covered?
No, I don't think so. It's really just a matter of like, it's going to change. Microsoft will enforce it. So if you're an organization that hasn't yet done it, or maybe you're still trying to convince leadership that it's an important thing to do, definitely use Microsoft's documentation of we're changing this is going away, we need to improve, as kind of your forcing function of like, hey, we need to do this and this is how we can approach it. I know it sucks for a lot of those legacy auth. I think a lot of us classically have had those old devices that use like old IMAP or SMTP for authentication. Microsoft has some ways to support people in that, but in a lot of situations, it will be a modernization forcing function for organizations, which isn't necessarily the most fun way of approaching modernization, but it is a way to do it. And Microsoft is essentially saying, we will not absorb this risk anymore. It is time to move forward and move forward with modern authentication, as they call it.
Mm-hmm. Just on a side note, what are your thoughts on Microsoft's approach to that? Do you think that it's a smart move?
Oh yeah, I think that they're right. I don't think they have a choice. It's kind of what it comes down to. Microsoft has become the biggest target at this point when it comes to business email compromise and breaking into accounts. And the potential for ransomware attackers and for really anyone to be able to attack these environments is it's too easy when legacy authentication is enabled, because you can just password spray from an old Outlook browser in SMTP, or an old pretend to be old Outlook, I should say, as SMTP, and get into an environment. And that's where at Blumira we see these BAV2 ROPC authentications coming in, or a bunch of failed ones from that. And that's really where we see the risk. I'm sure Microsoft sees it way more than we do, where they're just kind of having to fight against it. And the easiest way to solve it is basically to say, well, you know what? We're all just going to MFA for now. And then you get into the issues of how do you stop bypasses? How do you improve it? So, and that's where you come into MFA number matching, and then more and more and more and more. And I'm sure at one point or another, you'll see Microsoft hardware tokens that they'll start selling, and there'll be a whole thing like YubiKeys for Microsoft, because why wouldn't there be? But it's important, and it's one of those things that you need to have another factor of authentication if you want to be secure. It just is required. I don't know if enforcing it to be their app is the best way to approach it, but it's a way to do it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if that statistic of, MFA preventing 99.9% of account compromise attacks is correct, that's a statistic from Microsoft. So I'm sure it might be a little bit biased towards their views on it, but MFA certainly seems to help a very good amount. So if that's the case, then it certainly seems like a good approach from my perspective, at least. Well, those are all really great tips. Thanks, Nato and Matt, for sharing those. So excuse me. Skipping ahead there. Let's talk about securing data transfer. So we had talked about doing email encryption, but figured that we would broaden this out a little bit to include email, SharePoint, OneDrive. Why is it so important to ensure that data transfer with these applications is so secure?
Yeah, I updated this some when we first started talking about this around kind of like encryption and how does encryption work around Azure, and I expanded it out partly because so much has changed in 365 over the last year or two, where OME, Office 365 Message Encryption, if I recall correctly, is what it used to be called. There's obviously SMIME and a variety of other ways to do encryption of email. And then there's, of course, the newest Purview Message Encryption, which works with your large vendors like Gmail, Hotmail, really any of the larger vendors, G Suite, I should say. And that allows you to have more kind of granular control with your Azure handles the keys, and then they handle that through message encryption at the email side. And I more bring it up. Not everyone needs direct email encryption. A lot of people need like DMARC, and a lot of people need to ensure that their emails are secure and sent securely for that matter. But full envelope encryption is not necessarily something that everyone needs. However, if you do, Purview Message Encryption is a really, really straightforward way to go about it inside of 365 these days. It's easy to set up. It leverages Azure AD. It leverages Azure RMS for the key handling, and it just makes it generally easy to use. So if you're in a point where you're trying to figure out how to do encrypted emails, maybe handle PII or any sort of secrets, it's a good way of going about it. We recommend it. I like it. Purview is really nice, even though it's a whole new thing that Microsoft renamed again. It used to be something else, but nonetheless, it is a good way of going about it. And generally speaking, we'll talk about this in a little later, there are a number of ways that you can secure your email, but from a transfer perspective, making sure your email is set up properly, making sure you have the right MX records, SPF records, DMARC, and all that stuff stands as best practices for email, even as it pertains to 365, of course. SharePoint is its own beast of a thing. It's always important to build it out in a way that's best for your organization, how much data you're storing, how people are sharing that data. If you're doing DLP, there's a lot of really good features built into it, but I rarely am going to sit down and recommend anyone that does DLP unless it's like the last thing that you have. Really, the way that I approach SharePoint, we approach SharePoint and G Suite and any of the productivity suites that store data is just to limit your sharing and monitor the sharing that's happening. Monitor the access, monitor what they're sharing, monitor if it's going externally. Don't even allow it in some cases in the case of SharePoint. And it's hard not to in a lot of cases, but it allows you to kind of build a shell around your SharePoint where you can have expectation of use inside of it, and being able to view and have constant reports, maybe weekly reports, for example, on how many files are my users accessing? Am I having a user that's kind of gone crazy and is accessing a large number of files? Am I having improper use inside of it? Having that kind of visibility into SharePoint, or at the least limiting it to the extent where it would be difficult for someone to do that, becomes really important inside of SharePoint as well. You don't want it to become the file server from 40, like I say 40, 20 years ago, let's say, that's just full of information. No one's really sure where anything is. You kind of dig through folders. Keep it organized, keep it with strict permissions, limit the sharing, and kind of make your life easier by building out that structure. And the last thing that I'll mention is on OneDrive. Consider conditional access. Consider your external sharing and how it's set up. These are all part of the configuration of OneDrive. Not to say that that's easy by any stretch of the imagination, but do you want people to be able to externally share directly from their OneDrive? Should people be able to access this from something that's not in your Intune environment, or doesn't have certain things installed on it, or isn't in your domain? Those kind of things become really important, because in most cases, no, I don't want someone's OneDrive to connect if they aren't joined to the domain. Why would they need to? But you need to make sure that those kind of pieces are built out into your access controls for OneDrive, generally speaking.
One thing that I almost forgot about is I don't know how many of you are out there using Bitlocker, but for those who don't know what Bitlocker is, if you are, setting up encryptions and maybe you are using OME or some of these other features, you can actually, like, if you have inventory and you're providing your own systems and you're not doing bring your own device with how you have your employees working with Office 365 or your team, Bitlocker allows you to encrypt all of the local data on a system so that you can also centrally manage inventory. And also it's helpful for like theft scenarios. So if you have someone who's like a traveling consultant and you need to make sure that their files that they're accessing are safe and secure wherever they're going and all that good stuff, you can turn on Bitlocker. And Bitlocker even has ways to like remote shut down the entire system and like lock the whole thing so that no one can get back into it. And you can even like, I've done some things where I help get the authorities over to the location of the device and all that stuff. So you can like have the system lock itself down and then have the authorities go out and like go receive the device. Device theft does happen, especially when people are on the road. And then devices do get recovered. And Bitlocker is a great way to kind of start figuring out how to manage your inventory that has your sensitive data.
It's a great tip. Thanks, Nato. All right, let's move on to the next feature that we'd like to talk about, which is alerting for Microsoft 365. So there are a lot of different alert policies that can help you monitor different activities within your environment, and making sure that those policies are enabled are especially important for Blumira customers, right, Matt?
Yeah, so when you set up 365, especially these days, if you have a legacy, by legacy I mean let's say 2017, 2018 365 account, how these are set up will differ entirely than if you create a new 365 account. So this becomes really important to validate depending on the age of your account and what you're seeing out of your account. And the way that we at Blumira look at this, and like you can see in who it's available for, it varies highly depending on who those organizations are. You're going to have a default list of alerts that are created inside of your 365 once you have these licenses, depending on how that environment is set up. They'll give you visibility. They're not going to have logs necessarily associated, but they'll tell you when things happen. And they'll give you good details by default. Again, if you're a new account, if you're an older account, you should take a gander at how it's set up, and we'll drop a link for where these exist inside of your compliance environment for Microsoft. You want to go and make sure that you are defining these rules in a way that makes sense for your organization. And in some cases, they may already be set up, but you may just not be seeing the alerts, and they may be kind of going into a sinkhole. By default, they go to tenant admins. They don't go to a specific alert-based place. So the way that I approach this when I set up 365 is that I will change the important alerts that are set up by default to send to a proper alerting email that is an inbox relative for alerts. Then I'll go through and I'll turn on the alerts that are relevant for me, especially if they're not turned on by default. And that could range. Like forwarding rules are going to be enabled by default in a lot of situations, but they're going to be an informational alert. in some cases, you may not want that to be informational. You may want that to be higher critical. And if you're using Blumira, we'll send you an alert if that happens as well. However, it's always good, and it never hurts, to have the ability to perform any sort of granular alerting that's important to you and your organization. And that could be external file shares, it could be malware in files, it could be forwarding rules being applied, and generally speaking to it. And if you don't yet have a SIM, it becomes important for your organization to have a way to gain visibility into what's happening in 365. So if you aren't a Blumira customer, if you haven't figured out what you're doing yet for your 365 alerting and visibility, take a gander at the compliance, what do they call it? The compliance alert policies, there we go. And take a look at what it was set up by default by 365, will vary depending on the age of your account. And then review, you can go into new and then build out your alerts, and then look at what other things would be important to you and your organization. With a lot of SIMs, Blumira, a lot of them out there, we do a mix of two different types of detection. We'll do some detecting off of alerts that are derived from 365, because some of that data is not necessarily available in the logs. And then in a lot of cases, we'll do alerting based off of pure log data as well that comes from the admin API or from the Graph API. So it can be really important, and the way that we look at it is essentially two ways for you to get alerts that are important to your organization. You can get them from Blumira in a lot of situations, or organizations like Blumira, to determine where you have threats or issues or oddities within your environment. It also allows you to do reporting, which is also very important, but it also allows you to get that kind of internal alert bucket to say, hey, we are seeing an increase in external file shares. We're seeing more alerts associated with that. Let's go to our SIM and run some reports and figure out where we're actually seeing these external file shares occur over time and where we're seeing a trend. So it lets you kind of pull together two different viewpoints and data and say, hey, we know we can get alerting out of M365. We know that we can kind of expand it and contract it depending on what we need. Let's define this to say what works best for us, because you may not care about external file shares. You may be the kind of organization that works a lot with external people, so you know it's just going to constantly happen. So you want to turn that off or tune it to be differently. Whereas malware in files or forwarding rules being applied becomes really important to see, get that visibility into. And while a SIM like Blumira can help you get that visibility information, from a system perspective, it never hurts to say, this is my bucket. These is where the alerts go. I'm going to compare that with my SIM and validate that this is working the way I expect it to.
Yeah, absolutely. So it makes sense from, maximizing your value from a Microsoft 365 perspective, but then also if you're a Blumira customer, maximizing your value with us too, to make sure that you're getting all of the alerts that you need. Someone asked, is alerting from Microsoft 365 available in Microsoft 365 Business Premium? Do either of you know the answer to that question by any chance?
Let me take a look. Business Premium does support alert policies, yes. Looking at so this is where that matrix comes in really handy. And I will link this. Let me send this to you. Sure. Where this can come in really handy. So you can look and cross this and say, we can see 365 Business Premium, it supports alert policies. There are some alert policies that may not be enabled depending on what's available inside of your tier, but pretty much every tier other than parts of the frontline, 365 frontline, will support some concept of alert policies for your organization. So yeah, most of them will support alert policies, and it's worth going in and evaluating them for your organization for sure. Which is actually very nice, because some of them also won't support a 0AD, which makes it really hard to get data out of an environment. So it's kind of your only way to get alerting in those situations if you are in that position.
Mm-hmm. Great advice.
Fun for everyone.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on to our next feature that we wanted to talk about, phishing protection. So phishing is obviously a pretty big concern, especially when it comes to ransomware. It's one of those initial access vectors that can certainly lead to ransomware in a lot of cases. And Matt, I know that you have the approach of, it's too much to expect of users to not click on every phishing link that comes through their inbox. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and what you think the solution would be?
Sure, yeah. So it's something that obviously, I think a lot of us have heard over the years, and especially in security and sysadmin work of, well, we'll train the users or give users tools to be successful in stopping phishing. And that's really important. And it's something that has to happen. And not only does it have to happen for the organization, it has to happen because you need your users to become more computer and security literate. It helps you, it helps everyone around them as well for that to happen. That being said, no user will ever be able to prevent all phishing attacks. It just does not happen. I don't care if it's your CEO. I don't care if it's your lead security person. I don't care if it's your accountant. Targeted spearfish that is persistent will more than likely successfully land at one point. It is just the inevitability, and that's what we see in data. Targeted attackers will land, and that could range from leveraging any sort of similar connection into that environment, which is to say, like, if you have a sister company, hacking that sister company and leveraging them to get in, or just targeted spear phishing that works really well. So you really need to have not only your phishing protection figured out, which we'll talk about in 2 slides, but you also need to figure out like anti-malware, anti-spam. How do you make sure that if this fish has started to get through, how can you identify the bad stuff that's living inside of the environment itself? And what that generally gets you to be able to doing is to define, and the way that I approach this at the very least, is to define different groups within your Active Directory that lets you define how you want phishing rules and protection to be applied across that environment. And really what the best way to do then for most organizations, in my experience, is to look at the risk associated with each of those groups and then to apply protections based off what they need across them. And there are a number of different, as always, there are a number of different license packages that include phishing protection. The one you have depends on the features available and how you leverage it, of course. But the way that I recommend and the way that I look at this is if you are able to kind of bucket your organization into least risky to most risky, and their tolerance for dealing with email, maybe email that needs to be quarantined or leveraged in a different way, you are better off putting aggressive blocks in place for those users that could be more risky for you, that could have issues, and letting your, and I know it sucks, but letting the IT team kind of handle the oddities that occur, because it'll take less time to process those 10 weird emails a day than it will to resolve someone getting owned in the grand scheme of it all. So it's that trade-off that lives within security that is not fun. It's one of the hardest parts of security, is that trade-off in time and effort, but it becomes really valuable when it comes to defining these policies in a way that works best for your organizations, generally speaking.
Thanks, Matt. And Nato, I know that you had some thoughts about, how to manage phishing protection from an Active Directory or group policy standpoint. What can you say there?
Yeah, so especially for those who are running managed service providers, or if you're running like an app that you manage yourself with OAuths or something along those lines. Well, one of the things with phishing protection is you can set group policies inside of, well, there's like a group policy manager, and then Active Directory also lets you manage your computers and not just your users. So similarly to how like tools like Bitlocker can be managed and applied to things, you can use group policy to enforce things like phishing protection being on by default. One of the things about group policy management is you can also have, say, like default registry adjustments if there's something that you want to include in there. So if, say, you want to have phishing protection turned on by default, then you can also do things like have, say, like certain ports not enabled on devices by default to prevent like bad USBs and things like that. If there's like a device that really doesn't need to be USB to access in the first place. I remember one of the things I used to do a lot when I worked a lot more with managed service providers was use group policy with Active Directory to disable like disk drives, USB ports, different things like that as needed to ensure that it just lowers the risk on top of phishing, since there's all kinds of ways that you can get breached. But it's great.
Thanks, Nato. And we also had some screenshots that we wanted to share about these phishing policies that you might want to take advantage of. Matt, do you want to explain what this is?
Yeah, so this is kind of how I set up phishing in our, well, this is one of our demo environments. So many of our environments, generally speaking, where we test this out. And there's a number of different thresholds that you can define associated with your phishing. This is the second level. There's one level down, I think it goes up 4 levels, if I recall correctly. And it allows you to do some really nice targeting and user education as it's built into this. So by default, there's a number of things that are not turned on as a part of your phishing protection, like first contact safety tip is not turned on. A lot of these safety tips are not turned on by default. And these are the kind of things where if you're training your users and saying, hey, if you've never seen an email from this user before, you should be concerned about what's in this content. You might want to review who it was sent from. You might not want to click on this. You might want to report it. These kind of tips are really nice because then your users will immediately get that visual identification of, hey, you have never had an email from this user before. You might want to be careful as you look at this email and you want to review the content of this email. And the same goes for impersonation, domain impersonation, unusual characters like when someone has a Google domain, but it's zeros instead of O's. It lets you get that really kind of tight reinforcement of user education inside of your phishing protection. And that might be, for example, like we we're talking about, you might want to have everyone notified of like first contact safety tips. Like that's a good broad rule. Like everyone should be notified when someone emails them for the first time. I think it's a great rule. However, you might not want to have aggressive phishing thresholds across your entire company because maybe you don't want to deal with everyone having their stuff moved into junk or moved into spam more specifically. And this is kind of how I like to approach it for those situations where I say, I want a slightly aggressive phishing threshold. And if I do detect anything being impersonated from a user domain perspective or mailbox intelligence detects it, I want to be BCC'd on this email, but I want the user to still get that email and be able to work that email to not get in the way of their environment. So if they have the ability to report a potential risk, if they're getting these safety tips and you have an inbox like this, or you could build a special inbox for it as well, of course, that says, hey, I want to be notified in the special inbox if someone is getting impersonated emails. It allows you to have that kind of force feedback loop of, I know I'm training people, I know they're seeing tips, and I know I'm going to have visibility into the kind of emails where these oddities are happening. And you can have that really nice reinforcement. And the same goes for detecting if it's a spoof. By default, if I recall correctly, it moves it into junk. It does not quarantine the message. I'm a big fan of anything where there could be risk. Quarantine it, alert on that quarantine, give it admin-only access, and let people request access if they need it. Because you need to be able to kind of keep these things locked down from people if you can. And that per group Active Directory definition lets you be kind of flexible as to like, well, I guess I can trust these people within junk mail, but everyone else needs to be moved to quarantine if this is spoofed email, for example. So it gives you really nice granular capabilities generally.
Those are great tips, Matt. It seems like a delicate balance of managing users' expectations for how their email inbox is going to be, how they're going to use it and how they're going to look at it, and then also security, as is everything with security, is balancing users' complaints with making sure that your organization is as secure as possible. And this is definitely an example of that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just an area that like you want to make it as easy as possible for your users, or they'll come up with ways to get around it. It's just going to be the way it is. So you don't necessarily want to make it hard for them, which is why I like to do the BCC. But that doesn't mean that something won't get through. It doesn't mean they won't need help. So it is a trade-off, of course. You could, email is just a terrible thing in general, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide.
It's such a thing with users. One thing, if you see a number of users doing like the same thing or going around security measures the same way, instead of just like getting mad at people, maybe sit down and have a conversation, be like, hey, what would make it easier on all of you for us to like have our security needs met? And then maybe like come up with some alternative options that make it easier on the users if one of the reasons why security needs aren't getting met is because people are going around things that are sort of a lot to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to, I'm sorry, Matt, did you have
I was
something?
just gonna say there's some links that we can drop as well for how to get to the anti-phishing part of your security.microsoft. The whole thing is insane to navigate through, so I like to drop links if I can for where things are.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll drop those links in there now. And next, we're going to be talking about filtering within Exchange, which seems like it might be similar to phishing, which it is, but it does have some differences. I think namely that there's also anti-malware and other email threats that are within the message itself. Is that correct? Does someone want to explain the difference between those two policies?
Yeah, so you're spot on. And for a lot of this section, the last section, we're going to be mostly talking about kind of the additional portion of Exchange Online Protection, where it's really important to look at what the defaults are, especially like I said, if you grew through 365, your defaults are not going to be what defaults are today. So it can be really important if you set up your 365 environment 2018 and then you grew through it, which is awesome. Because I bet you have a bigger 365 environment than a lot of us at this point. It becomes even more important at that point to kind of sit down, evaluate what your defaults are, what you might want them to be, and then get them updated to a more kind of refined place to go about it. So what I recommend doing, and we'll put the links for the threat policies in here as well, that we're going to talk about here generally, is that we're talking about filtering threats that live inside of the message. And it's related to phishing, but Microsoft does not connect the two. They are different components inside of 365. There's anti-phishing and there's threat policy. Why they're separate, I don't know. Will they be together in a year? Maybe. Will they be 8 different products in a year? Probably. So we'll find out where Microsoft takes it as they grow. But really what we're talking about here is how can you grow your anti-spam, anti-malware, and your other settings within your environment that are kind of best for you. And the best example I can give, generally speaking, is that if you go and you look at your threat policy, for example, that lives inside of your environment, you're going to see your anti-phishing, your anti-spam, your anti-malware, safe attachments, safe links within your policy section, which is also, it's great. It's great to have all those things if you have the proper licenses. But your default settings, generally speaking, for inbound and outbound, we'll use anti-spam as an example for this conversation, are going to be refined specifically to what works for defaults in 365. And a lot of that has to do with how your organization works and what you might be getting inbound into your organization. And if you are an organization that is not expecting certain types of emails, you can go into your anti-spam and improve your security very quickly across your environment, which is to say, like, should there be a URL that redirects to another port? If you're not an organization that generally is receiving emails like that, probably not. And the same goes with things like VBScript or JavaScript inside of HTML from emails. And to a question that we just got, if you want there to be SPF record hard fails, your anti-spam inbound is the place to do that, where you can say, you know what, I want to do hard fails on sender ideas. I do hard fails on any sort of SPF. I want to make sure that anything that's potentially risky gets dumped into junk or dumped into spam, or however you want to approach it, because there are a number of different ways that you can approach it. And you can, of course, define allowed domains inside there as well. So maybe you want to block all JavaScript or VBScript coming through your email, which is great. I recommend it, but you know it's going to come from this one provider. So it lets you do that granular definition inside of it. And the same goes for outbound. Should your users be sending hundreds of emails an hour? Probably not. If any of you work for a company that sells things, you've probably dealt with your salespeople sending emails way more than you'd like them to. It's a good place to stop them from doing that and to say, hey, please don't use our domain to spam. That's why there are MailChimp and SendGrid and other things to do that from. And it allows you to kind of get more control over your own organization spamming out, which becomes really important if you don't want to get those marks against your domain, generally speaking. And that's just anti-spam. As you look through them, and I recommend you do, there's anti-malware as well, which becomes really important to update the defaults on, at least I recommend you do, because by default, they will not block commonly threatening environments, generally speaking. And by that, I mean, it will not block a cab file or a command file or an exe file. None of those will be blocked by default, generally speaking, inside of the environment of 365 unless you go into your anti-malware and turn these things on. And they'll by default do malware scanning and they'll purge that malware, which is great. And that's a great default. But we really recommend, and I really recommend, looking at what you really want your users to get through email and what you want your users to get through another way. Like there should be better ways to receive exes or receive cab files or command files. And if they need to be using them, IT probably needs to be involved as to why are you downloading APK files siloed onto your Android phone? Please do not do that. Please stop doing this. Like, those are things that should not be happening. But by default, 365 will happily allow those files to flow through. So the anti-malware policies become really important to check. How's that quarantine happening? Where is it going? Is the admin the only one able to access it? How's it flowing through that environment, generally speaking? And the last one that I'll vamp on is the safe attachments and safe links. They're really important to make sure that they're kind of moving forward and growing inside of your environment. They're really useful broadly to define how people are touching data and using them. And if you go into, like, we'll use safe attachments as an example, you go in there now, it just has like a default window where it looks like, hey, it's working, great. But it's not really doing a ton by default. And if you are willing to try, what I recommend trying if you have the time, is trying out the new dynamic delivery component of, especially safe attachments. Safe links has a related thing. And what dynamic delivery does essentially is it will deliver the email, but it will hold back the attachment essentially. And it will then scan that, it will evaluate it. And in some cases, it will require the admin to release that attachment back to the user at that point. So you'll get the situation where a user can get their email, they'll be notified the attachment is being held for review, and then you can evaluate it, you can release it from the quarantine back to them, or you can hold it because you can see it and be like, ah, yeah, this is clearly not a good thing. I'm not going to release this back to you. I don't want you to try to install a random exe, even if this isn't a phishing email. This isn't something that should be done inside of our environment. So it lets you have this really nice kind of structured environment where you can say, and this is brand new, it's a preview feature, so it's brand new, where you can go and you can say, I have my safe attachments, I want dynamic delivery, I want the message to be delivered immediately. However, then I want it to be scanned, held in quarantine, redirected to me for evaluation, and then I will send it back to them if I think that it's okay. And there are some hitches, of course, that live inside of the funness of Microsoft, but it is a really nice kind of move forward that we're seeing from Microsoft, or they're opening up these new kind of methods and policies that live within the safe links and live within the kind of environment of what they call threat policies within 365. But what you have to do is come in and say, how do I want this to work? How do I want this to work for my environment? How do I want to be notified that these things are happening? Otherwise, it can kind of just happen in the background and you just kind of aren't aware of it. And you may have something like Blumira working that's going to give you some information, like we saw malware in a thing, which is great. But it never hurts to have the environment set up in a way that works best for you as well internally. And I say that as the co-founder of Blumira. It's important for you just as much to have that visibility into how your environment works, just as much as it is for us to have visibility in the environment, how it works.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and you spoke a little bit to this, but how you're able to get visibility is by using these, Microsoft security features that we've talked about, and then sending those alerts to Blumira, and we're able to detect on all sorts of Microsoft 365 detections. And we actually have a free edition for Microsoft 365 that's really easy for organizations to quickly deploy. People have been able to get that up and running within minutes. Certainly less than an hour, and really easy to be able to see what the value is within your organization. So take a look at that. You can access it at blumira.com/free. Do that here in the chat today. No credit card or sales conversation required to get that started. So once again, super easy to get that up and running. And we're able to detect, like I said, on a lot of the Microsoft 365 policies that we've talked about today. And it's great for small teams that, struggle with managing those threats day to day. We do a lot of the work on the back end, including the parsing, the deployment, the detection rollout. We do all of the configuration for you on our end. So really, like I said, just very easy for smaller teams and smaller to mid-market businesses to get started with us. So take a look at that and just see what the value is, try it out. And if you don't have value from it, then no skin off your back. And if you do have value from it, then come talk to us and let us know how we can help you. So I hope that we got some good tips for you guys today. Thank you so much for joining us and for listening in. I know that, it takes a little bit of time out of your workday, but we really appreciate you sitting down with us and learning with us. And we hope that you join us on our next webinar. So stay tuned for that. Nato and Matt, thank you so much for joining us and giving your insight. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll see you on another webinar here sometime soon.
Thank you, Nato.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a
Hope you
great day,
rest
everyone.
of the day.